When people think of poetry, they often try to emulate that highly structured formal verse that they learn about early on in childhood. The problem is that this form of poetry is often the most difficult to get right. For that reason, when working with new poets, I like to begin with the realm of narrative-free verse. I'm Daniel Ruefman, and this is my crash course in narrative-free verse poetry. Let's begin with the concept of narrative poetry first. With roots in the oral tradition, narrative poetry first and foremost has to tell a story. The epic poem of Beowulf is also a narrative poem in that way. The same goes for the ancient poems that told the original story of Robin Hood, and in Greece, the Odyssey and the Iliad. All of these are epic stories told through poetry. Much like any work of fiction, narrative poems should have some kind of a plot, a conflict that escalates as a series of events unfolds. These conflicts usually involve different characters and voices in that poem. Finally, they often wrestle with common poetic themes. Themes like love, for example, either unrequited or reciprocated. These poems often explore themes of good versus evil, personal redemption, revenge, and courage, or simply the internal struggles we face as we come of age. Now that we have a working definition of narrative poetry, let's delve into the topic of free verse poetry. Free verse poetry is essentially free-form poetry. While more traditional styles of poems follow strict meter and rhyme schemes, free verse emerged in the late 19th century with the works of Walt Whitman. Essentially, free verse poetry is composed of a series of non-metered, non-rhyming lines that mimic natural speech. That is not to say that poets don't still use poetic devices like rhyme and rhythm and repetition in their works of free verse poetry. It just means that they don't have to follow that rigid structure all the way through. To simplify this, just think of free verse poetry as a no-rules zone. When the opportunity for rhyme emerges, feel free to take it, but don't feel obligated to. Use alliteration when it suits you, but don't force anything. And let your lines be whatever length they need to be. You don't need to end them at any in particular point based on syllable or word length. In free verse, the main idea is don't overthink form. The first and foremost thing to worry about is your message. If you do that, your poem will be successful. So, what exactly is a narrative free verse poem? Well, first, it's a poem without any strict restrictions on form. You can do with it what you want to do with it, and you don't have to worry about shoehorning it in to fit some kind of arbitrary structure. A narrative free verse poem is also a poem that mimics natural speech, so when you read it aloud, it should sound like you talking. A narrative free verse poem also has to tell a story by using some poetic devices, although it's not forcing you to use any poetic devices in a specific way. And finally, a narrative free verse poem should explore some common literary themes. In other words, love, themes related to courage, battles of good versus evil, and even the angst that comes with coming-of-age tales. So, to further explore this concept of narrative free verse poetry, I thought I'd share one from my own collection, my own repertoire. It's called Learning Under High Bridge. My son dangles his limbs through the rungs in the rail under High Bridge, where the Mississippi cuts its channel through St. Paul. In a language all his own, he chirps and points as if to say, This means log. See it floating? That is a riverboat. Daddy, say it with me. He points in turn to the concrete footings, steel scaffolding of the bridge, at plastic caught in the current for Lower Town. And with each abstract burble, pop, and squeal, he names things he will translate for me later. and I try not to see the inky blackness sweeping 1 meter below his toes. And I tell myself that his body cannot fit in the space between the steel. And yet my mind flickers to an image of him in the current, and me giving chase, my useless limbs flailing, unable to pull my mast through the water, unable to grasp a leg or arm as he is swallowed by the covetous stream, like everything that bloats this river while it consumes the whole of every tributary from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. But I force out the image and remind myself that he is safe here. He cannot fall into the river he names Durda. He reaches for wood floating out of reach, past the footings toward the city. He waves at a boat on a sunset cruise, to the couple jogging along the far bank, toward the city he will name home. Now, on your own, I want you to think about the following questions as they relate to this poem. 1. Which poetic devices do you see at work in this poem? Do you see alliteration anywhere? Do you see rhyme, imagery, metaphor? What about rhythm? Is there a rhythm at certain points in the poem? And how is that rhythm created? Next, describe the conflict that was raised by the poem. How would you summarize the story? Who are the characters? What are they feeling? How do you know? Once you've done all that, now it's time to get on with it and write your own narrative free verse poem. And I have a few tips that should help get things started. First, when picking the subject of your poem, pick a memory, a strong memory from your own life, something that really resonates with you, something that really stands out. Next, create a list of images that are strongly tied to that memory. For me, in this poem, I remember taking my son to a park under High Bridge. My wife was playing with our dog in the dog park that ran along behind us, and my son and I were walking up and down the river. So we saw the river, the Mississippi River, the bridge itself, the railings. These are all images that are tied into that experience that I cannot separate from that experience. So go ahead and make a list of your own images that are tied and that are inseparable from that experience that you're trying to recreate for us. Then set the scene, but use action verbs to make it more engaging. Don't just show us a railing, have somebody interact with that railing. For instance, in the poem that I offered, the first line, my son dangles his limbs through the rungs in the rail. That is an active image. My son is dangling. I'm not just saying there's a railing here. I'm having my son interact with that railing. So whenever possible, try to use action verbs to try to make it more engaging for us. And whenever you're trying to deal with emotion, avoid telling us what people are feeling and show us what you're feeling. I hope that helps you get things started with your own narrative free verse poems. I hope that you found this useful or helpful. And until the next one, I'm Daniel Ruefman, and I will see you online.